This week, we're going to focus on pasture-based solutions to some of our wheat pasture issues due to the dry conditions through September, whenever and way into October, as we were normally relying on getting pastures planted and having places to put cattle later on in the fall. I'm going to talk a little bit about what to do with pasture, wheat pasture if we're short. Then Rick Clovis and some of the producers, Tyson Johnson and Taylor Reed, are going to talk about some of their dry wintering programs, what we can expect as far as gain and performance later on from their systems. Next week, we're going to get into some dry lot growing programs. And then the week before Thanksgiving, Thursday, November 18th, we're going to have Dr. Dale Blossy talk about program feeding systems, high concentrate feeding systems for growing cattle. So, like I say, welcome to our Ranchers Thursday, focusing on growing cattle. I'll let Dr. Lawman and Dr. Biggs introduce themselves.
Go ahead, Dr. Biggs.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Rosalind Biggs. I am with the College of Veterinary Medicine and beef cattle extension specialist as well.
David Lawman. I have a split research and extension appointment here at Oklahoma State. Work primarily in the area of cow-calf and some stocker. Welcome. Glad you take some time to join us here this afternoon.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and start with my presentation. So, you know, we talk about growing cattle without wheat pasture, and we did get some rain and some nice weather through late October, and it's really kind of rescued us as far as having some pasture to offer. But there's a lot of producers that either were delayed in planting. A lot of our no-till producers aren't able to dust wheat in ahead of a rain, so they had to have some moisture in order to get good seed soil contact in their drilling operation. Other producers were able to dust in a clean till operation. They got the rains and they were able to get a stand up and start growing, you know, ahead of, you know, some of the others. If you're in a clean till operation and got a lot of rain there in late October, you know, it took a few days to get cattle or get wheat to where, or the fields to where you could get in and plant them. So when we think about wheat pasture, what we really like to see when we turn cattle out, you know, end of October, 1st of November, usually, you know, our plan is the 1st of November, but, you know, we all have this dream of being able to turn cattle out by October the 20th, and sometimes it does work. But, you know, have a boot top tall wheat pasture by that time, but that doesn't always happen. And usually what we see is something like this, you know, 400 pounds of forage dry matter by the end of October, 1st of November. A lot of our fields look like this year. And, you know, even when we have slightly more, you know, 3 or 4 inch tall wheat, you know, that's still only about 650 pounds of forage dry matter per acre. And a lot of times we're forced into turning cattle out at this time. You know, right here we have right at 1,500 pounds of wheat. You know, this is, you know, the target that we're going to try to turn cattle out in. And, you know, our stocking rate can be adjusted depending on how much forage we have available. And this is from some research that we had conducted over several years, looking at the initial forage availability, or the number of pounds of forage available per pound of animal body weight. And when we turn cattle out, and if we had, you know, 5 pounds of forage dry matter available per pound of animal body weight, or about 2,500 pounds of forage for a 500-pound calf, you know, we got fairly good assurance of a really good gains ranging from about, you know, 2.5 to nearly 3 pounds a day during that winter grazing period. It slopes off quite a bit when we get beyond that. As you see, we get much below that number, you know, even though that average at 2.5 or 3 pounds of dry matter per pound of animal body weight, you know, the average is about 2. The range in expectations is fairly large. So, you know, we need to look at trying to get, you know, 3.5 to 5 pounds of forage dry matter. And if we're much below 5, we need to count on really good growing conditions for the rest of the winter in order for that wheat pasture to keep up. What if that doesn't happen? What if we're faced with, you know, something that looks like this, where we have 600, 700 pounds of forage dry matter per acre? You know, a lot of times we can, you know, turn cattle out with about 3 acres per head and get fairly good performance expectations out of that. But if we're short on wheat pasture for the number of calves we have, we probably need to do something in order to stretch that pasture or to grow those calves until we have more forage available. My rule of thumb is there's about 200 pounds of forage dry matter per inch in height. So, you know, target is 5 to 6 inches or taller. One of the problems we have in managing dual purpose wheat is we not only have problems this year on the front end as far as when we turn out, but we have a time limit as far as in the spring on when we can, how long we can graze those calves. And, you know, when we have dual purpose wheat, it's, you know, very valuable. This is from some work done by Stan Beavers out of Vernon, Texas. He's an ag economist since retired from that time. This is based on 2008 numbers, and it's comparing 2 farms that were in his area. One was a grade only, looking at fairly good net returns on that, but got over a 60% increase in net returns by going with dual purpose with some graze out compared with just going grazing only. So that's why we do it, and that's really, you know, an important economic aspect of this forage and grain production system. But our planting date, and this year it didn't matter when we planted it, it didn't come up until we had those rains. They have an effect on both forage and grain yield, and grazing can have both a positive and a negative effect on grain yield as well. We need to remember removing those cattle at first hull of stem. So a lot of our early maturing wheat, you know, it gets to that first hull of stem by late September. So, you know, there's a time frame on how long we can graze those calves out there. You know, rules of thumb or some research from here in Oklahoma with Dr. Edwards and some of the others. If we plant in early September, we're delaying steer turnout by about a month, just if we wait until September the 25th. So we're delaying planting by about 20 days, but we're delaying turnout by about a month. We can decrease steer gain by about 80 to 90 pounds, but it increases the grain yield, you know, substantially from, you know, in their study, it was 39 to 49 bushel per acre. You know, here's the response on grazing past, you know, first hollow stem or past, you know, early jointing on these pastures. And, you know, if we can go just a few days, you know, a week, maybe we're not hurting yields too much, but it really gets bad if we go very far past that. So there's a time limitations on how far we can graze those cattle in the spring if we're aiming to go for a wheat harvest. And that becomes a problem when we're delayed in turning out. One of Daryl Peel's articles, he said last week, if we, wheat pasture will be delayed, we may get, fairly good forage yields this fall, but if we delay it too much, here's what can happen. So some researchers, Bill Phillips and Sam Coleman at Fort Reno, weighed cattle every week after they turned them out on wheat pasture. And cattle lost body weight when they were turned out into good wheat pasture for about 2 weeks. And that's a lot of it's just a change in gut or change in diet. It's as severe a change as going from a dry hay diet to a feedlot diet on wheat pasture. Going from it's very similar when we go from a dry hay diet to a wheat pasture diet. So it took them about 20 days of grazing to reach their initial body weight. And then they only gained 23 pounds by 30 days of grazing. And the next 30 days, those cattle gained about 3 pounds a day, or a little over 3 pounds a day. So the average for that entire 60 days was 2 pounds a day. So that's going to really, we really need about 60 days on these cattle on wheat pasture to get the kind of performance that we were expecting out of that. And if we're planting these early varieties, we're going to be limited on the number of days we have in front of us if we're delayed in turnout for too far. So, we get a lot of questions on providing hay to cattle on wheat pasture. Dr. Horn and Terry Mader, whenever Terry was a graduate student here, looked at supplying very low quality forage to cattle on wheat pasture, very low intake, and really no positive effect on performance or bloat when they provided those low quality forages like wheat straw. But if we provide some good quality forage, that becomes a different story. We conducted some research over 2 years with real short wheat pasture. There was about 500 to 700 pounds per acre at turnout. We offered hay free choice, and this was what I would call fairly decent or to average quality hay, 10% crude protein, 55% TDN, real common, what we would see with a well-managed Bermuda grass. And these were either stocked at 2 acres per steer with no supplementation, or 3.5 pounds per day of a soybean hull supplement, or we increased the stocking rate to 1.25 acres per steer with 3.5 or 5.25 pounds per day of soybean hulls. What we saw at that 2 acres per head stocking rate, without any supplementation, those cattle gained right at 1.8 to 2 pounds per day. If we increased the stocking rate and fed a supplement along with the hay, we had about the same level of performance. And these are cattle that we would expect to gain at that 2 acre stocking rate at 500 pounds. Those cattle would gain about 1 pound per day without the hay. So with the hay and supplement, we were able to get adequate performance from those calves. If we added with keeping that low stocking rate and added supplement, we only got up to about 2.14 pounds per day, and that took about 9 pounds of feed per pound of gain. Increasing the stocking rate, we increased the gain per acre, so we had a fairly efficient response to supplementation from that at about 5 pounds of supplement per pound of gain. Then when we increased it even more up to that 0.75% of body weight or 5.25 pounds per day, in further increased gain, it was a little bit less efficient at about 6 pounds of feed per pound of gain. Some other research that Dr. Horn did, and this was conducted at Fort Reno as well, and it was Gary Vogel's master's thesis. He looked at stocking steers at 2.2 acres per steer with no supplemental silage, or going with that same stocking rate or increasing the stocking rate with free choice access to sorghum or corn silage, depending on the year they conducted the trial, and they had to feed this daily. So quite a bit of labor involved, but they're providing a very high quality, low protein type forage source. What he saw was as they increased stocking rate, they increased the amount of silage those calves ate, but they also tended to increase average daily gain, and then or kept it about the same at that highest stocking rate. Whenever we keep stocking rate or gain the same but didn't double our stocking rate, as you'd expect, they doubled the total body weight gain per acre when they doubled stocking rate. So really good gain response if you have some, high quality roughage like a corn silage that you can feed daily. Some of the research I was involved with, we got ourselves into a tight spot where we had some pasture, we had some cattle we had to get out on pasture. We had some that pastures that were, really good forage. We had 2,500 pounds of forage dry matter per acre in those fields, and we were able to stock 1 steer per acre with right at 4 pounds of forage per pound of steer body weight. We had some pastures that were kind of tight. So we went ahead and stocked those that they only had 1,800 pounds of forage dry matter with 1.5 steers per acre, but we provided a round bale silage. It was a Bermuda grass round bale silage, free choice, where we supplied that weekly to those cattle out on wheat pasture. We decreased our gains slightly by essentially taking our forage allowance in half, but we went from 3.3 pounds a day down to 2.6 pounds a day, which is still respectable. The ending body weight at the end of that fall grazing season was 780 instead of about 820, and our gain per acre was increased by 50 pounds. So in a somewhat uncontrolled or just more of a demonstration to look at something similar to what Gary and Dr. Horn did back in the 80s, we saw what we thought was fairly good results. So we went ahead and decided to repeat this over 3 years. And we had, similar to Dr. Horn's research, calves stocked at 1 acre per head, 1.5, or 2 acres per head with silage. And then in the spring for graze out, we increased our stocking rates as well, and we fed silage as well. Our silage from these bales weighed 1,670 pounds. They were about 60% moisture, 14% crude protein, and 55% TDN. So it was Bermuda grass, not a super high quality forage, but still fairly palatable and a good forage. So looking at animal performance, as we increased stocking rate, we decreased average daily gain, we increased grazing days per acre, gain per acre increased, as you would expect, as we increased the number of animals with not a severe reduction in performance. During the spring, we had a really poor forage growth year in the spring. So our control animals that had done so well in the fall didn't do very well in the spring, only 1.4 pounds a day. They were short on forage through the spring graze out. Where we offered silage, we were able to offset that quite a bit. So overall, as we increased stocking rate and increased the amount of silage that they consumed, we saw a increase in gain per acre overall at a cost of about 3 to 4 pounds of silage dry matter per pound of additive gain per acre. We decreased average daily gain in summary about 30%. We increased gain per acre by about 50%. We decreased the impact of that grazing we had on stand by offering a supplemental forage with that. And I did some analysis at a current projected stocker value of gain of about $1.12 per pound. The silage would have to cost 17 cents per pound or less to break even. So fairly good response and not too bad economically on that large of bales. So with that, I could take a question or two, or we can go on and go on to Rick and let him introduce his speakers. I don't
Dr.
see
Beck,
any
yeah, I'm not seeing any questions right now. Just as a
yeah.
reminder to all our attendees, you're certainly welcome to put your questions either in the Q&A or the chat, and we will handle those as they come along, or we have some time reserved at the end of the presentations, of course, for questions and answers as well.
So to get to the main part of our program today, Rick Clovis from Osage and Pawnee counties is going to introduce our guest speakers, and I really appreciate you guys taking time from your busy schedule to work with us on this. Rick?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Beck. Yeah, I'm Rick Clovis with OSU Extension, like Dr. Beck said, here in Pawnee and Osage County. And Dr. Lahman had contacted me and asked me to see if we had any ranchers to talk about how they dry wintered their calves or their stockers on standing native forage is kind of what the resource is here in our area. So I asked Taylor Reed and Tyson Johnson are sitting here next to me, and I'll let them, when they're doing their part, start their presentation. I'll just let them tell more about themselves and their family, the history of their ranch and what they're going to do. And with that, I'll start sharing, and I'll let Taylor's going to start. Okay, go ahead, Tyson. Oh, excuse me, I messed up there. Go ahead, Taylor. Okay, I'll get over here to Taylor's slides and messed up. All right.
Well, thank you guys for having these programs. I think these programs, everybody listening and watching, and Tyson and myself can attribute to saying thank you to OSU Extension for having programs like this. Again, my name's Taylor Reed. I'm from Osage County in 4-acre Oklahoma specific. Cow-calf producer. We also run stalker steers in the winter, spring, and summer months to utilize our native pasture the very best. I've got a couple different sets of cattle that we went back in the archives and found some data on those. I know it's kind of old, whether 2014 and 2015. Feed prices were a little lower than they are now, but it does give you an example of how we've wintered some stalkers on a very low a low feeding program or small feeding program, not to try to really get any other gain out of them other than about a pound a day in the winter, winter months. Let's see. I'm going to have Rick help come back to those slides and explain a few things. Are these slides on here, Rick?
Yes, those are it starts up here. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in 2014, this particular set, 602 steers we purchased around January 15th. They had an average weight of 559 pounds. All of them were purchased here in Oklahoma, various livestock markets. The feeding schedule we had them on was an average of 2 pounds a day of 14% cubes, also purchased locally here in Oklahoma. They were again on native pasture only. We did give them some hay throughout the winter because of the weather conditions, but it wasn't given to them in a sense of trying to get a lot of gain out of that hay anyway. And also some free choice mineral, a very basic stalker mineral purchased locally as well. After the winter months, you can see, it might say on there, we came back in April 22nd, which was 97 days of grazing. They weighed 659. They gained exactly 100 pounds, which, average daily gain was about 1.03 pounds for those winter months. And so that was kind of what we set out to do, was get our pound a day. Those cattle were implanted in the spring or on that April 22nd date, and then ran on native pasture through the summer until July 15th. With those, back to those feed costs, you can see that cost doesn't even compare to what it is today. But it kind of still sets the picture as to this scenario of how we got the gain we did. But you can see there, it was cost to gain was 0.21 for the winter months, and which is fairly inexpensive. July 15th, when those cattle came back in, we weighed them. They weighed 889. They were given about 3 acres per animal, which gives us, that's about 84 days of grazing, and gives us a gain of 2.74 pounds per average daily gain, excuse me. Rick's got a few more figures on there than I know how to explain. Do you want to share some of those?
So you go to the next slide, and then we can talk about them.
Okay. Okay.
And this is 2015.
Okay, and then on the 2015 set, it's very similar. It does have some differences, but we bought 697 steers January 15th, weighing 577. Same type grass, native stand, same hay schedule and mineral as well with these cattle. Just trying to get the best out of the pasture for sure. And we came back on April 19th, which was 94 days of grazing, and they weighed 653, which was a 76 pound gain over the winter, which brought our average daily gain to 0.8 pounds per day. Those cattle were implanted then as well to head on into the spring and summer. As you can see, that shows our winter cost to gain was 25 cents, which was, I think, slightly higher than the previous year, but still fairly inexpensive to today's values. Went through the summer on those cattle. They came back July 15th or July 13th, excuse me, and they weighed 873. Was 85 days of grazing, and that gives us a 2.59 average daily gain. But those two examples, do summarize kind of how I do some things now as well, a dry winter, and try to get, if I can get a pound a day through the winter, I think that the cattle have done well for considering the dry wintering method. Is there anything you want to add on that, or?
Yeah, we just went back and got some average market values to figure the value of gain on there was the main thing we were wanting to show there. And you can see like 2014, it was, that was the year of high prices. So it was fairly easy to make money when you sell them for more than you buy them, you're probably going to make money. But then, so you can see in this 2015, this slide that's up there now, when the cattle were bought there in January, and prices were still high, but then prices started sliding that spring, which would be, something you wouldn't normally expect. But then the value of gain, those cattle actually lost value from that January period to before they started grazing in April. But then by keeping your costs low, they were still able to make money, is the point I'm trying to show there, that they made money, even though they were actually losing value going through that grazing period, but you didn't have a lot of risk tied up in them and getting caught in even though they're gaining well, you may still be losing money because of inputs and those kinds of things. That's really the value of the worth of the value of gain I was trying to show there.
Okay, and I guess we can go back to this 2014, if I didn't stay there long enough, and see those values as well. For those cattle, which seem to be a little stronger after the winter feeding.
Yeah, they did in 14, they gained well, and you can see, he paid, the average was $200 a hundred back at 559 pounds. But then when they weighed 889 at the end, they were, sold them for $202. So that's really good versus they were but they'd lost money in that wintering period if you just went by penciling it. But by having low inputs of the dry wintering program, it allowed those cattle to be profitable once you were able to put on the grass gain on them. It's kind of the point trying to make there, that the value of using that resource, the standing dormant native grass, it's really that's one of the big values that is underutilized by lots of people, I think, on native grass. I'm just trying to help you see that you still can get gain on them. But it can be a very economic gain, is the point.
And there's still there's some maintenance that goes into native pasture. Obviously not the maintenance you'd have on a introduced grass, but again, you take care of it and it will do you well and come in those growing seasons when it's at its optimum. With that, does that kind of wrap me up?
Yeah, that's
Okay.
it. And we can kind of hold questions, and Tyson can do his part, and then we'll take questions for both of you at the end. All right, Tyson.
So, good afternoon. I want to echo what Taylor had mentioned. These lunchtime series are well put together, and there's a lot of good information, something that I try to watch or go back and watch many of them. So hopefully today we add to the value. I'm Tyson Johnson, live here in Pasture, Oklahoma, manage the Sooner Cattle Company ranch here in Osage County and southern Kansas. I've lived here about 4 years. The company's owned the ranch since 1989, and it's been mainly a stocker operation. And I wanted to start off, at least and talk about our system, because I've learned that most of our decisions are made by having clear goals and clear objectives. And what creates those goals and those objectives are the systems that you work in and the parameters around that system. And so for us, it may be a little different. We're a vertically integrated system. So we own the cattle all the way from birth to harvest. We own our own feed yard. And so a big part of our system is trying to manage the flow into the feed yard, the inflow and the outflow. And so that dictates what we do here in Osage County. So we take about anywhere from 13 to 15,000 yearlings from Florida. They show up here in August, September, and then we try to ship them off the following July. And so we run stockers year round. And this is really what I try to do that fits well for our system is the fall gains. We can put at least a pound of gain on these animals relatively cheap. And then in the winter time, again, our goal is to somewhat slow these cattle down to help flow into the feed yard, but we still want them to remain healthy and keep going forward. And so what I want to do is at least put a half a pound a day on the cattle. And then in the summer gains, we capitalize on some of the compensatory that we get and want at least 2 pounds of gain on the cattle. And I'll mention for Sooner, we're a little different system. About 6 years ago, we went to a little more of a intensive rotational grazing system. And I'm not as concerned about the individual performance as I am pounds produced per acre. And so we measure margin per acre and pounds produced per acre. And so in a little more traditional system, I think the gains would be a little better because of diet selectivity. But for us, it's worked well for our program. One thing so what I found is what we do, the fall cattle that come in from Florida, we usually do a little over a pound, 1.2 on average, and they're getting anywhere. We end up with about 3 pounds a day per head of 18%. And and I'll talk a little later on how we arrange to feed what we feed as far as the type of cube and the crude protein percent. But we can start them out with a pound. By the end of the fall, we're about 3 pounds, and we can pick up a pound gain on them fairly easy. In the wintertime, then, we've had a lot of different groups of cattle, different herds, and different parts of the county. And, some of the cattle haven't done as well. We might only do a quarter of a pound, and then some of the cattle we might do close to a pound. And there's a lot of variables and factors that go into determining that outcome. But like I say, we try to average around a pound or a half a pound a day. And we're feeding about 4 pounds of 18% cube to get that. And then in the summer, we're about 2.5 pounds of compensatory with some mineral supplement. With the cubes, we supplement the mineral, but we fortify the cube and put the mineral in the cube. So like I say, it varies on, herd, pasture, genders, and class of animal that we get on their performance. But roughly that's about where we're at. We feed very little hay. We try to feed no hay. And it depends on the year, how much hay we feed. We've went from feeding 0 hay to 400 or 500 pounds per animal, depending on the year and the conditions. So, but the goal is to not feed any hay. And how we calculate, or how I've come to the feed program that we use now, I've just used the extension's nutritional requirements for a 500 pound steer to gain a pound. And what they're saying the animal needs is 1.2 pounds of protein and 7.2 pounds of TGN. And so we sample our forage, and we know what it's producing. And then we work with a nutritionist. He formulates a recipe for a cube for us, and then we bid those out. And it's just a simple math game to try to make up the difference. I've found that managing the health of the animals is a balance between the science and the art of it. So the science gives us a good starting point, and then a good cowboy with a good eye can do the rest. And then I always calculate our cost on a per pound of crude protein or a per pound of TDN. So when I'm getting bids, I want to figure out what it's going to cost me per pound of protein or energy, depending on how we're balancing our ration and how the grass looks that year. Typically, a higher percent of protein is always cheaper when you calculate it on a per pound of protein basis, but you can't forget about the energy when you do that. So that's a little overview of our program and how we've arrived to what we do at Sooner.
Okay, thank you, Tyson. So we'll quit sharing here, and we can go back and turn it back over to Dr. Beck, and if you have questions, they'll be happy to answer them. Thank you, Taylor and Tyson.
Yeah, don't get too far away. I think we'll have some questions for you. So my question I typed into the chat there, Taylor, for you, I'm just curious if you noticed, and I know it's been a while back since those two sets of cattle went through, but do you notice any difference in those 2 years from, weather stress, a little bit lower performance, both winter and summer for your second group? What do you think the difference might be?
Well, I wish I could answer that specifically. I don't recall exactly what the winter presented us with that year, but I would assume the cattle were very similar quality. We usually buy very similar cattle each year, so I would think the quality was there. And so I would definitely lean towards the weather or the type of spring we had for those summer gains to be a little different too there. And I didn't mention it during the presentation, but these pastures were burned or were spring burned, which has added some increase daily gain for us. And we always try to do some form of burning or some areas of burning where our stalkers are going to be on each year. But again, to answer your question, I don't, but I think it would have more to do with the winter we had leading into the spring or coming out of the spring there for the difference in the gains.
Okay. Any other questions show up yet, Dr. Biggs?
Not seeing any yet. The veterinarian has to ask, gentlemen, animal health, do you have some general approaches to how you handle these cattle when they arrive or through on these kind of pasture conditions? What seems to be, what's the strategies that seem to make a difference for you?
Yeah, for us, it's health's a big issue, and we do everything we can to keep the animals healthy and moving forward. Nutrition's a big part of it, making sure that they're on good pasture and have the nutrition in front of them. And we also, we're big on animal handling. So when the cattle come in, we spend some time and try to get them settled and calm down and used to people. And then we take time training them to come to a feed bunk or a feed truck where we can handle them. And we do a lot of our treatment along the feed line. So for us, it's a big deal to try to get them handling right and making sure that their nutrition's on par with their requirements. And that's probably the biggest impact we have on health.
Are either or both of you feeding Rumensin or Bovatec through the winter and or summer? We
do. We feed it both in the summer in our mineral and in the cubes in the winter.
We don't. We just give them the implant when we process in the spring, and we don't add anything to mineral or the feed throughout the summer.
Okay.
So I've got a question for both of you, and I'm assuming there's going to be differences between those operations, but what kind of cattle are you bringing in? Are they weaned? Are they fat balling calves? And, you know, when you have different types of cattle come in, do those change your expectations as far as performance through that dry wintering period and then later?
Absolutely, it would change the performance. And our cattle are, in these two examples, were locally purchased here in Oklahoma. So they're going to be I know they could come from other areas to get here to sell, but they're more so like a native Oklahoma calf. And the quality is, I feel, good. It may not be the fanciest, but it's good quality. We're not buying something that's a low quality animal anyways, but weaned definitely. But if we, you know, different times we get some unweaned too, and may take a little longer before they start with the upward gaining. Of course, you know how that weaning calves can be, you see some downturn sometimes, but mainly weaned and native type animal.
So all the calves we take, or all the stockers we take, come from Central Florida. We're fortunate that they come off one ranch, and so we're not commingling off different operations. However, they are off different units or different parts of the ranch, but they're weaned on the truck. They gather them that morning, sort them, load the truck, and send them to us. And so they're balling calves, and they come to us, and we've been real fortunate to get them straightened out, and they do quite well for us.
How long does it take you to, or do you try to get them straightened out before you turn them out on your dry wintering program?
So they get turned right out into, you know, we start with small pastures, but we don't have any really holding facilities or dry lots that we feed them in. So from day one, they go out into little pastures, and they're on native pastures the whole time they're here. And it's just like any weaned animal, you know, it's a good 60 days before you can kind of let your guard down and relax a little bit. So we see breaks anywhere from 2.5 to 3 weeks typically in the cattle, and it's just a matter of managing through it.
A very interesting presentation from both of you. I want to thank you again for offering to do that for us and our clientele that joined us here today. I think it's just fascinating. And I don't mean to start a wrestling match. Rick, you may have to serve as a referee, but I'm curious. Taylor, you're feeding 2 pounds of a 14 and getting 0.8 to a pound. And Tyson's group is feeding 4 pounds and getting lower on average. I mean, what do you guys think? Is it genetics? Is those cattle are coming from Florida? I mean, what gives there?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great.
Not very fair question, I know.
No, I think it's a great question. I don't know how Taylor's stocked, but for us, like I say, I'm not as worried about individual performance as long as they're healthy and going forward. It's really more total pounds per acre. And so I don't know if you measured on a pounds per acre basis, what that would be. But I would assume that's probably the difference. We're running, very large herds. So we have 2,000 to 3,000 animals in a herd. You're going to get a little inferior on the cattle on that size of a herd, a big variety within that herd. And that probably is what hinders a little bit of the individual performance, would be my guess.
Yeah, I would second that. I think that is, when you string out 200 head versus 2,000 head, there could be a little difference in who eats the most or who gets to eat and who doesn't. And maybe there's some there, but also I'm the native part, the calves we're buying, the weather doesn't change much from Oklahoma City to my house, a little bit, but not much. And maybe that has a little to do with the way they have performed in the winter too.
So I had, Paul, if you don't mind, I have one more question. I've been up there when Evan was feeding Tyson a group of heifers, and actually this was, I believe it was 2 years ago. And I said, well, where's the end of them? We're looking down the cube line and you could not see the end of the cube line. How do you deliver that much feed to a group of heifers? I don't know how many thousands you have in a group. How do you deliver that much feed in a day? And I assume you're interval feeding like 3 times a week or something.
Yeah, we try to feed as many times a week as we can. It usually comes out to 4 to 5 days, just because we have, cows and calves and other classes of animals on the ranch that we have to work during that time of the year. But no, that's a good question. We've had to adapt our delivery system. And so we've built some trailers that you can hold, 10,000 pounds of cubes on and stick out 2 spouts. So we're kicking out about 20 pounds per second on these trailers. And then, so we've had to adapt just our delivery system in order to put enough cake out so all the animals can get to it.
Very interesting.
And we do, if there's animals that on that inferior side, then throughout the year, we pull those off and create another herd of some of those weaker animals so that they're all taken care of.
I think it kind of goes to, just to add into that, what he's told me is that the range of animals that they're managing, they do a phenomenal job in my estimation. I mean, I've got 300-pound calves to 700-pound calves that they're getting in the same loads. And so how they do that, and that's why it works though, like you mentioned, how they're controlling, managing the entry into the feedlot part of it. So that's how it works for them.
Yeah, we're a unique system. I don't think it's, something that could work for everybody. And, but fortunately, we've tried to adapt to our system and try to find those leverage points that helps us in the long game.
How are we doing on time? One more question I guess I would have is Taylor and Tyson, both through the winter when you're dry wintering, are you rotating pastures? What's your management system there? How do you?
Mine is not necessarily a rotational grazing. We do rotate, or we do move pastures. Everything starts out really close and eventually gets further away, but we don't come back into those pastures with the same cattle after a duration of time. So no, I'm not rotating in that sense.
We do rotate pastures, and the idea of the whole system is that we hope that we can hit one pasture in the wintertime or dormant season and once in the growing season. Not all of our camps are set up so we can do that. So we might have to hit it 3 or 4 times throughout the whole year. But that's the ultimate goal, is once in the dormant season and once in the growing season, and try not to stay in the pasture longer than 7 days. But like I say, there's a lot of variety over the ranch and how the camps are set up and where the different guys are at in that system.
Very good. Paul,
You're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. We're actually on time or a little bit ahead of schedule, and I really want to reiterate, Rick and Tyson and Taylor, I really appreciate the time you spent. Excellent overviews of your operation and just a different way. Central Oklahoma, we don't do that very often. So I think that's a great tool a lot of us can add in our toolbox to hold cattle over for spring grazing or get us through at least we can market in a different time of year. So I know it works great for y'all, and it's something y'all have done for years and years, but it's not something a lot of us in the rest of the state think about putting stocker calves out on dry pasture for sure. So once again, I appreciate everybody tuning in for our Ranchers Thursday Lunchtime series. if you have other questions that you think of after we end, you feel free to text, call, or email Dave, Roslyn, or myself. Look forward to seeing you next week when we talk more about dry lot based growing systems. So thanks again, and have a great week.